What's up? So I just want to make a video about the orbit and discus, and I guess it's just the orbit and like hammer and shot put. Javelin doesn't really have an orbit. I mean, I guess some could argue, but this is mainly going to be orbit for shot, disc, and hammer because it's the same principles. And I'm going to talk mainly for a right-handed thrower. So for the lefties watching, just do the opposite. Like when I say like a direction, just it's the opposite. You guys can figure it out. You're smart. So I'm gonna use Virgilia Selecta or Virgilia Selecta, depending on who you ask. I don't actually know the correct pronunciation. Um, and if the Alekna name sounds familiar, this is the dad Alekna, the father of Mikolos Alekna, who's taken the world by storm nowadays. But before that, Vigilius Alekna is arguably the best discus thrower of all time. He's the second furthest thrower ever with a 73.88 meter throw. Two-time world champion and a two-time Olympic champion, along with some other medals here and there. And I think has probably the fifth most or third most 70-meter throws ever. So I think Gerd Cantor still holds that, although I think maybe Daniel still. I forget. That's not what the point of this video is. But the reason why I'm choosing him as a template, and this is going to be for mainly male throwers. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of the orbit. This is just going to be a basic video because the orbits do kind of change woman to man, depending. Just because the implements can fly differently, women can get away with a lot more stuff than men. But in terms of like their orbit and the flight and all that. But this is just going to be a kind of a more basic video. So this is him at the 2003 World Champs. And this is a 69, oh, what did it say? 69-69. Wow, what do you know? 69 meter throw. So a 69 meter throw. So, that's pretty far. And the reason why I choose him, because normally I would choose someone like Gerd Cantor to just explain what the concept of an orbit is, but I think Alekna has the best orbit for a male thrower who's a reverser. And I think Robert Harding has the best for like a non-reverser. And the reason I say that is because Alekna just has so much out on the disc, and I think that's a very good part of it. And it's not too high, it's not too low, it's not too level. He just puts it in all the right places, and his orbit is just so consistent, throw to throw. I don't think I've ever seen. I think maybe I can count on two fingers the amount of times I've seen Virgilia Selecta have a bad release, and it's because of his orbit. So first, let's explain what an orbit is. So if you think what a planet, and it's tilted, so there's a low and a high. I know these. Let me do different lines. So there's a low, and then there's a high. All right. And if you notice when he throws, so he winds, his low point is somewhere around here. His high point is around here. And they line up with these arrows. Alright? And if you notice where his high point is, he releases it at that same angle. So in discus, it's very easy to notice if you have a screwed up orbit, because the discus will wobble, or it'll be pancake, which means like the face will be up and not the rim. So if you don't have a clean release, it's most likely because you have a bad orbit, or you have a good orbit and somewhere in the throw you put it off its orbit. You put the discus off its orbit. So there are a couple rules of thumbs with the orbit. So I want you to notice. Oops. Yeah. Okay. Let me go here. Okay. I want you to notice that when he winds, his low point is right in the middle of them. So you want to think about your low point in the belly button or more the right side. And you notice how he reaches long around. So he's not going diagonal like that. He goes a long around. You want everything to be long. You want everything to be as far away from you as possible. That's hammer and discus. Shot put, that's, kind of impossible. Um, but in discus and hammer, when you wind, you want it to be long. You want the implement to be far away from you. All right, so he winds long, and then he just winds pretty level. And then I want you to notice that same path that he did. That he did his wind up. So let's trace that. So it goes bum, bum. Alright. So let's see if his orbit goes through those points. Yep. And of course, like, the camera zooms out, but I mean, you can tell it goes through that same path that he winded with. So whatever path you wind with, that's the path of your orbit. So if you can't wind properly, that you can't have a good orbit. So it's not good for your like, if his low point was here, that's not a good thing. All right, when he winds, you always want it in the middle. All right. So I want you to notice. So his low point is like somewhere around here. Let me get a different line. Somewhere around here. Now I want you to notice where his high point is. His high point is here. Now obviously, because of the quality, oops, I didn't mean to clear those. Here. Somewhere around there. Alright? And obviously, because of the quality of the video, I mean, it's hard to kind of tell. Because, this was in 2003. But you can get the picture. Wherever the low point is, the high point must mirror it. Oops, I keep zooming in. Sorry. So a common mistake that I see beginners make is that the orbit is here. So their low point is here. The high point is here. So if you tend to throw in the cage a lot, but like you're not pulling and stuff, it could be because your orbit's opposite. Another way to tell if you have a bad orbit is if you release. And when you release, you feel like you have to scoop the discus. And what I mean by that is, like, so at the finish, you would like put your arm super down and have to throw with your arm instead of your hips. Alright? So these are very crucial things. And another way that you can tell if you have a messed up orbit is if you release it and it just flies like a laser. So it just flies super low to the ground. Alright? Instead of getting some height. Now, and also, you have a screwed up orbit if if it goes way too high and it just goes straight up in the air. That means you're pulling it off its orbit. Alright? So these are things to watch out for. So how do we get to this good orbit? So one, the wind. Like I mentioned, when you wind super long and make sure that you have a low point. Alright? Low point in the middle of you. Alright? And then once you wind back like him, you got to keep the discus behind your right hip. And again, lefties, that's different. The discus would be the left hand has to be behind the left hip. Alright? So if you notice throughout this entire throw, he keeps the discus super far back behind him. So if you let so say you're good here, and then you let the discus catch up to you and the discus is here. Now the high point would be here because it's ahead of the hip. So that can screw up your orbit. Alright? So that's something to look out for as well. You always just want to keep the discus behind you. One, because it would screw up your orbit. And two, you just won't throw very far if the discus is ahead of your hip. But that's a different video for a different time. So those are a couple things. One is, and then the other thing is, keep it as far away from you as possible. And as long as your hips move correctly through the throw, if you just keep it far back and you just keep it as far away from you as possible, so the disc as far away as from your hip as possible, and as long as your hips do the right thing, you should never really have to worry about an orbit, because it will just happen. But the important thing is you don't try and make an orbit. So what I see a common thing that a lot of beginners do is they move their arm up and down to try and get a high and low point, where really the hips create the orbit. So I want you to notice, so he does not move his arms at all. Well, his right arm. He does move his left arm, but I'm not going to get into that. But he does not move his right arm. Alright? And I want you to notice, so his hips sink here. So that creates the low point. So he sprints, and he gets his right butt cheek ahead into the throw. That creates the high point. So he sinks into the hip, drives. That creates the low and high point. Catches, and now his hips go here. They're low, and then when he goes to throw, he pushes up and around, and that creates the high point or the release. All right, and I think there's I cut off the video, so I guess we can't see the release. You just have to take my word, or you can just watch the video. Not on this, but just look up the video. On YouTube, and just see the quality of release that he gets. So, and you'll know, because it'll just fly super pretty, and they won't really have a wobble. Now, a little wobble is okay. In fact, a lot of far throwers, when they release, have a little bit of a wobble, but as long as it doesn't look like a dying goose when it's in the air. And what I mean by that, if it's just flopping all over the place and doesn't actually look like a discus throw, and doesn't look like a very nice thing to look at, you probably pulled it off your orbit, or you don't have an orbit, or you have an opposite orbit, or just something happened in your orbit. Every time you have a clean release, it means that you had a good orbit. All right. So, and this comes naturally to some people, and this doesn't. So, but it's a very achievable thing if it doesn't. You just have to actually work on it. Some people, just pick up a disc and just naturally do it, and you just never have to think about it. So, some people, it takes a while to understand. So, yeah, I hope this video helps you guys. And again, I'm not going to there's so many things that can cause a bad orbit, and so many things that can cause a good orbit. These are just the basic things. If you want me to make a more detailed video about the orbit, I can just leave it in the comments, but I don't think you guys want to make me sit. I don't think you guys want to listen for 30 to 40 minutes about me talking about the orbit. And I know I just put up a discus video, but this is the same concepts for hammer and shot. Now the hips do different things in hammer, but for discus and shot, the same rules apply. It's just easier to see an orbit in discus than in shot, and then in hammer. The same principles apply. You want the low point somewhere in your belly button, and you want the high point somewhere here. So in hammer, the high point would be there, through all of this. So it's a little different, but you don't want the orbit to be here. You don't want the orbit to be here. It's more here in hammer. So that's something that maybe I can talk about in a different video. And again, it also changes. It's not exactly a straight line. It is a little more here, but just not as much as discus, kind of. It's different. But the same rules apply. Basically, you want to keep the hammer as far away from you as possible. You want to keep the hammer long. You don't want to knock it off. You don't want to knock it off its orbit. the thing is with orbit, if you try to make an orbit with like your arm and stuff and everything, it is really hard to do that in shot put. I guess you can do it with your elbow, but I mean that's not. I guess I don't know if that's a very common thing. I don't really see that very much. If anything, I see people just throw super flat in shot put, like well beginners. But the orbit in shot put is actually very easy to obtain because the shot is connected to you. So, and shot put is actually better to throw a little flatter than in hammer and discus. So, it doesn't really matter as much. I mean, you still need an orbit. But, you see it a lot more, like, talked about a lot more in hammer and discus. So, yeah. The same rules apply, basically. It's just like hammer and discus and shot. Like, hammer compared to shot and disc, it's just different ways to get the orbit, but the same like theory applies. You want a high and a low point. You want the implement as far away from you as possible. You don't want to create it with the arms. You want the hips to create it and create the orbit, and those are basically the rules. Oh, and you want it like the low point in the belly, like somewhere in your belly button. All right, so in the middle of you. So those are the basic rules of the orbit. So, yeah, and again, so for women tend to have higher orbits just because the way the flight works in the discus. So you tend to see women have like much more exaggerated orbits, just because the higher you can fly at 1K, the better. A 1 kilo discus or the woman's discus. So it's not very good for it to fly flat at all, unless depending on the wind conditions. But in general, well, I mean, flatter. No implement should fly flat, like completely flat. The rule is if it does not get above your head when you release it, you're doing something wrong. All right, so if you look at a video and your implement is like in line with your head when you release, chances are you didn't really have an orbit or a good one. So, yeah, that's something to keep in mind. So, yeah, I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys enjoy this video. And let me know if you want me to make a more detailed video about orbit, or if you want me to make videos on orbit in hammer or in shot. Because this was a little more of a discus kind of video. But, yeah, otherwise, thank you for watching. Have a good day.